In the dark, forgotten corners of Caribbean history, a legacy of resistance smolders, buried beneath centuries of silence. From the sugar plantations to the volatile swamps, enslaved people dared to fight back against the brutality of their captors. These uprisings were more than just desperate acts. They were sparks of defiance, fueled by a will to be free. Today, we reveal the untold stories of those who resisted in ways that history nearly forgot. Imagine a night in the Caribbean during the 18th century. The moon is high, casting long shadows over a dense jungle. The air is thick with the sounds of unrest. From within the shadows, a figure emerges, one of many who've been bound by chains, yet is now free in their heart and mind. The enslaved people, who for so long lived in fear, are about to rise. It's a story that's rarely told. The courageous uprisings of the enslaved in the Caribbean, the blood spilled in their fight for freedom, and the consequences that shook the very foundation of the empire. These uprisings weren't just about the physical act of rebellion. They were an act of survival, of reclaiming dignity and humanity in a world that sought to strip it away. But what you might not know is how these uprisings were often erased, forgotten, or downplayed. Today, we'll peel back the layers of history to expose the resistance movements that sparked change. These revolts were not just moments of rebellion, they were the seeds that grew into a wider movement, one that eventually led to the end of slavery in many places across the Caribbean. Throughout the Caribbean's colonial history, the European empires established vast plantations driven by the labor of enslaved Africans. It is in this dark and brutal environment that some of the most significant uprisings in history took place. Yet, despite their importance, many of these stories remain obscure. While we may have heard of the Haitian Revolution, the most successful slave revolt of the time, there were numerous other uprisings across the islands, each with its own story of bravery, defiance, and tragedy. These slave revolts were often fueled by a powerful desire for freedom. The enslaved people, stripped of their rights, their cultures, and their names, fought back in ways that ranged from subtle acts of resistance to open rebellion. They fought not only for their survival, but for the chance to live with dignity and autonomy. Their resistance was not always successful, and many were met with violent repression. Yet, the legacy of their struggles lives on today in the Caribbean's vibrant cultures and in the ongoing fight for justice and equality worldwide. In this video, we will explore the uprisings that history tried to bury, stories that shine a light on the bravery of those who fought, often against insurmountable odds. These uprisings remind us that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit's desire for freedom is never fully extinguished. The Caribbean was a region built on sugar, rum, and tobacco, industries that thrived on the backs of enslaved Africans. By the 18th century, the demand for labor to work the plantations was so great that European powers enslaved millions of Africans, bringing them across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. These Africans, torn from their homelands, were forced into hard labor, suffering under cruel conditions with little hope of escape. But the human spirit has a way of surviving even the worst of circumstances. The enslaved Africans brought with them not just their bodies, but also their languages, beliefs, and a deep-rooted yearning for freedom. This yearning was passed down through generations and became a driving force behind the uprisings that followed. One of the earliest significant uprisings occurred in Jamaica in 1673. A group of enslaved Africans on the island, led by a man named Cudjoe, staged a rebellion against their oppressors. They gathered in the mountains, forming the Maroon communities, who would become one of the most prominent groups of escaped slaves in the Caribbean. This was a declaration of war against slavery itself, a message that the enslaved would no longer submit to their masters. Throughout the 18th century, tensions began to rise across the Caribbean. More and more enslaved people were finding ways to resist. Some poisoned the food, others sabotaged machinery, and many escaped into the forests, creating guerrilla armies. But one of the most significant uprisings took place in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, in 1791. This revolt was set into motion by the brutal treatment of enslaved people, but it was also a response to the French Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The enslaved, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, fought not only for their own freedom, but for a chance to create a society where the oppressed could rule themselves. The Haitian Revolution became the largest and most successful slave revolt in history, and it had far-reaching effects that shook the entire Caribbean. But even in places like Barbados and Trinidad, where revolts failed, the seeds of rebellion were planted. In these places, the enslaved developed codes of resistance, rituals, spiritual practices, and networks of rebellion that allowed them to fight back, even if they did so in smaller, more subtle ways. The greatest acts of rebellion, however, weren't always the large-scale revolts we hear about in history books. Many uprisings were suppressed before they could grow, while others were brutally crushed. But the spirit of resistance remained. One such story took place in the Bahamas in 1830, where a group of enslaved people, after learning of an abolitionist movement in Britain, took matters into their own hands. They raided plantations, burning crops, and freeing their fellow slaves. This was a desperate but powerful act that resonated across the islands. However, many of these uprisings met violent retribution. The British, French, and Spanish empires weren't about to let go of their economic lifeline without a fight. Enslaved people who led revolts or even spoke out were tortured, killed, or exiled. Despite this, these uprisings made waves. They proved that the enslaved would not quietly accept their fate. The aftermath of these uprisings often went unreported or was obscured by colonial powers. Those who fought for freedom were vilified as criminals, while their oppressors were depicted as benevolent rulers. But the legacies of these uprisings lived on in the cultural and political changes that followed. The abolition of slavery was just one part of the story. The resistance laid the foundation for the civil rights movements that would follow in the 19th and 20th centuries. The stories of these uprisings were passed down through generations, preserved in the songs, dances, and traditions of Caribbean people. Even though many of the revolts failed, they sparked a movement that could not be extinguished. The uprisings in the Caribbean may have been silenced by time and the brutal forces of colonialism, but their impact cannot be erased. These movements remind us that even in the face of unimaginable oppression, the will to be free is a force that cannot be easily crushed. Today, the descendants of those who fought in these uprisings carry with them the memory of their ancestors' courage. From the streets of Havana to the shores of Jamaica, the Caribbean remains a testament to the resilience of its people. These uprisings didn't just shape the history of the Caribbean, they shaped the world. But as we reflect on the past, it is important to remember that the fight for freedom didn't end with the abolition of slavery. Today, as we see the continued struggles for racial justice, equality, and human dignity, the lessons of these uprisings remain just as relevant. The past is not just a story of suffering and oppression, but of triumph, resistance, and the unwavering desire to be free. If these stories have inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. The struggles of the past are not just stories to be told, they are lessons to be learned. By remembering these uprisings, we honor the courage of those who fought for freedom. If you want to learn more about the untold histories that shaped the world we live in today, check out our related videos on the Caribbean resistance and the heroes who never made it into the history books. By subscribing, you'll be the first to receive more stories like this, helping us keep the voices of the past alive. Let's continue to remember, reflect, and resist in the face of injustice. Because the fight for freedom is never truly over.